Late December 1943. Germany frost crept along the edges of every canopy at dawn. In the gray-blue light, contrails cut across the heavens like veins of smoke over a dying empire. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann adjusted his oxygen mask, eyes narrowing against the glare. Above, horizon to horizon, the sound came first. A low, steady thunder that grew until it filled his cockpit. They weren't squadrons. They were cities in the sky. Hundreds of American bombers, their formation so tight and unending that the air itself seemed to vibrate. Each carried men he would never meet, machines built faster than he could shoot them down. Every victory his comrades claimed in the morning vanished by evening, replaced by fresh silver wings rising from England. On his gun camera, the impossible truth unfolded. The United States was building bombers so quickly that the Luftwaffe's kill counts no longer mattered. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in vast plants of steel and sweat, new liberators rolled off the line, almost one every hour. And that realization, more than the roar of engines, was what chilled Germany's finest pilots. By the spring of 1942, the Second World War had entered its industrial phase. A battle not just of soldiers and squadrons, but of furnaces, factories, and fuel. While German pilots dominated the skies of Europe, the United States was still preparing its full entry into global war. Washington's strategic planners understood that defeating the Axis would depend less on tactics and more on production. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe was at its peak. Its pilots were confident, its machines refined through years of combat experience. To the German command, the idea that America, a country still mobilizing, still arming, could match their precision-built war machines seemed absurd. But deep within the American Midwest, something extraordinary was taking shape. In Michigan, a vast building stretched nearly a mile long, the Willow Run Bomber Plant, designed by Ford Motor Company. Its mission was audacious, to mass-produce heavy bombers as if they were cars. Blueprints were simplified, jigs standardized, and every process was broken down into steps a new worker could master in weeks instead of years. By late 1942, the United States had become a factory nation. Steel mills worked around the clock. Women filled the tool bays. Men too old for the draft handled rivet guns and welding torches. The concept of Rosie the Riveter wasn't a slogan. It was the face of a nation learning to fight with machines instead of muskets. The strategy was clear. Quantity as a weapon. The United States Army Air Forces planned to crush Germany through daylight precision bombing, destroying factories, refineries, and transport lines. It was risky, and no other Air Force had ever tried it. Daylight meant accuracy, but also exposure. American B-17 and B-24 crews would fly into the heart of the Reich in formation, trusting that defensive gunnery and courage could hold them together. Germany, confident in its seasoned aces and thick belts of flak, believed it could bleed the Americans out faster than they could replace losses. After all, in the early years of the war, even the best factories in Europe took weeks to turn out a single combat-ready aircraft. They didn't understand what had begun in Detroit. Henry Ford's engineers brought automotive logic to aviation. Assembly lines replaced craftsmen. Conveyor belts carried fuselage sections down bright-lit tunnels. Where once a bomber took months to complete, Willow Run promised to roll out one every 63 minutes at full speed. By mid-1943, that promise was becoming real. Over 8,000 B-24 Liberators would eventually emerge from that single complex. Each one was built from parts produced by hundreds of subcontractors, tires from Akron, gauges from Chicago, ball turrets from Connecticut, all stitched together by a workforce that had never built aircraft before the war. Every bomber carried 10 men, 10 .50 caliber guns, and thousands of pounds of bombs. Each symbolized America's new doctrine, industrial saturation. For the Germans, the first signs appeared high above Bremen and Kiel. Their aces, men who had dominated the Battle of Britain, found themselves staring at formations so vast that their attacks seemed to dissolve into smoke and tracers. A German officer reportedly called it Der Himmel voller Feinde, the sky full of enemies. Yet in 1943, the American gamble was far from secure. The daylight bombing campaign was still experimental. Navigational errors, mechanical failures, and brutal losses at Schweinfurt and Regensburg nearly broke the confidence of the 8th Air Force. But behind those losses, the American industrial machine did not slow. Each bomber that fell over Europe was already being replaced by another rolling out of Michigan, Texas, or California. To Germany's frontline pilots, it seemed impossible. For every Liberator or flying fortress they shot down, another appeared days later. The math no longer made sense, and by the end of that year, the Luftwaffe's intelligence officers began to realize the truth. America wasn't just fighting a war. It was manufacturing one. If you're enjoying this deep look into real history, subscribe now, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. By autumn 1943, the American air offensive was straining under the weight of its own ambition. The daylight raids over Germany had turned into flying gauntlets of flak and fire. Each new mission seemed to demand a higher cost in blood. On August 17, 1943, nearly 376 B-17s lifted off from England in twin attacks on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the heart of Germany's aircraft and ball-bearing industries. The Americans hit their targets but paid dearly. 60 bombers never returned. Hundreds of airmen were lost, captured, or scattered across enemy territory. In command rooms from London to Washington, hard questions filled the air. Could this strategy survive the math? Could America truly replace men and machines faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them? The answer would come from the factories, not the front. While 8th Air Force fought to stay airborne, America's War Production Board accelerated the tempo. Aircraft output climbed past anything the world had ever seen. Between 1942 and 1944, the United States built more than 275,000 aircraft, of which roughly 18,000 were heavy bombers. Each carried the reach of an entire battleship, but could be built in a fraction of the time. The Willow Run plant became a symbol of this transformation, a living organism that never slept. Trains carried aluminum ingots in by the hour. Finished bombers rolled out and were test-flown from the adjoining airfield. The plant's mile-long assembly line curved in an L shape, ending in the runway itself. Journalists called it the great arsenal of democracy made visible. But Willow Run wasn't alone. Douglas, Consolidated, Boeing, and North American had built similar ecosystems of subcontractors and supply chains. The U.S. government created entire towns to house workers. On the West Coast, aircraft plants glowed through the night under blackout shades as women and immigrants filled the shifts once held by men now overseas. The scale was breathtaking. By the end of 1943, a new bomber took off from an American runway roughly every 63 minutes, an almost rhythmic pulse of metal, fuel, and manpower. Across the ocean, the Luftwaffe's situation was reversing. Once the predator, it was now the prey. German aircraft factories from Regensburg to Kassel were hammered daily. Production fell, repair depots burned, and supply trains never reached the front. Yet the German fighter command, the Jagdwaffe, still fought on. Pilots like Galland, Barkhorn, and Hartmann clung to the belief that skill could still offset quantity. They learned to attack from above, to dive through bomber formations and escape before gunners could track them. But even their courage couldn't counter the math. For every ace who downed 5 or 6 bombers, hundreds more American crews were already in training back home. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army Air Forces quietly prepared the next phase of its revolution, the long-range escort fighter. Engineers at North American Aviation were perfecting the P-51 Mustang, a design that would change the equation forever. Its drop tanks and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it range deep into Germany, finally allowing American bombers to fly with protection all the way to the target and back. By late 1943, the Mustang was still arriving in small numbers, but it was a promise on the horizon, a whisper among bomber crews that perhaps the losses would soon end. In German intelligence reports, analysts began to note something unprecedented. No matter how intense the battles, the number of enemy aircraft over Europe never declined. American formations only grew larger. To the Luftwaffe, it was as if the Allies had found a way to conjure bombers out of thin air. They hadn't. They had simply mastered industrial timing. Every rivet tightened in Michigan, every engine tested in Ohio, every map drawn in a Kansas classroom, all of it synchronized into a system that could replace entire wings in a single week. It was warfare by clockwork, and it was relentless. As 1944 approached, the balance of the air war was about to change forever. The human angle. Hands that built victory. Far from the front lines, the American home front became its own battlefield. Inside cavernous hangars, the sound of riveting guns echoed like machine fire. Each spark that flew from a welder's torch was a weapon forged. Millions of civilians, most of whom had never touched a military tool before, were learning to build the future of air power. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. They were machinists, inspectors, and line supervisors. They measured tolerances, read blueprints, and kept production moving 24 hours a day. A young mother in Cleveland might tighten the bolts of a B-17 wing rib, knowing her work would someday fly over Berlin. Posters read, "The man behind the gun depends on you." The human scale of the effort was staggering. More than 2.1 million Americans worked directly in aircraft production by 1943. The average worker built, indirectly, the wings of freedom. It was not patriotism alone that drove them. It was the daily rhythm of the assembly line. The feeling that every turn of a wrench mattered. Each shift change was a battle rotation. Each finished fuselage was a victory scored not by a pilot's skill, but by ordinary people's endurance. In those crowded plants, the war's outcome was quietly decided before the bomb bays ever opened over Europe. The technological angle. Machines that made machines. American engineers didn't just build bombers. They built the systems to build them. That was the unseen genius of the arsenal of democracy. The aviation industry applied automotive mass production principles to aircraft for the first time. Jigs and fixtures replaced hand measurement. Component standardization allowed different plants to assemble interchangeable parts. A tail section from San Diego could be bolted to a fuselage made in Tulsa without adjustment. This engineering philosophy turned slow craftsmanship into industrial rhythm. Where Germany's aircraft were often precision-built by skilled artisans in limited batches, America's bombers were modular, produced like clockwork in volumes no European plant could match. At Willow Run, the B-24's aluminum skeleton moved down a mile-long conveyor as engines. Wiring and gun turrets were fitted in sequence. At the end, pilots climbed aboard, taxied to the runway, and took off directly from the factory. In one astonishing photograph from 1943, a line of completed Liberators stretches out of the hangar doors like an army of steel birds awaiting flight. This wasn't just production, it was choreography, a national symphony of logistics and precision that played 24 hours a day. The enemy's angle. Eyes of the Luftwaffe. For the German pilots who faced these endless streams of bombers, the experience was surreal. They climbed through thin air in their Bf-109s and FW-190s, often outnumbered 20-1. The sky above central Germany turned into a moving fortress, layer upon layer of four-engined bombers, guns glinting in the sun. Every attack meant diving headlong into walls of 50-caliber fire. Pilots like Adolf Galland and Walter Dahl later described the futility of those encounters. Even when entire Gruppen managed to tear through a formation, the gaps they created would close the next day. Every airfield in England seemed to spawn another fleet. In one Luftwaffe intelligence report from late 1943, the analyst noted bitterly, "We destroy them in dozens. They return in hundreds." For Germany's aces, this was the first glimpse of a new kind of warfare, one defined not by heroism, but by replacement. Every downed bomber became a line item in a ledger that the United States could erase overnight. Many pilots realized too late that they were not fighting men anymore. They were fighting a machine, a continent-sized engine of production that never slept. As 1944 loomed, that realization began to break the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. The leadership and policy angle. strategy from the top behind. Every rivet and sortie was a vision shaped in Washington. At its core stood General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the United States Army Air Forces. He believed that air power, not armies or navies, would define modern warfare. To win, America needed not just planes, but the industrial power to sustain them indefinitely. Arnold pushed for unprecedented cooperation between government, business, and labor. Automobile companies built wings, shipyards machined bomb racks, and sewing machine manufacturers stitched parachutes. The line between civilian and military blurred completely. In 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt set the goal: 60,000 planes per year. It sounded impossible, but Arnold and his engineers refused to scale it down. "We are not producing airplanes," he said. "We are producing freedom." Every decision that followed, the prioritization of aluminum, the rationing of rubber, the centralized design bureaus, was aimed at speed and volume. The result was an ecosystem where failure at one plant triggered immediate compensation by another. The strategy wasn't perfection. It was momentum. Meanwhile, on the German side, production was stalling. Bureaucratic overlap, resource shortages, and Hitler's interference delayed modernization. While the Allies streamlined, the Reich fragmented. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's aircraft procurement meetings had become desperate gatherings of men trying to solve a mathematical impossibility. Arnold's industrial gamble had become the Allies' most powerful weapon. A bomber every hour, not as an exaggeration, but as a demonstration of total national focus. The tactical angle. Formation as a weapon. In the air, tactics evolved alongside technology. The early chaos of 1942's missions gave way to a deadly precision that mirrored the factories below. American bombers no longer flew in scattered clusters. They flew in combat boxes, interlocked layers of aircraft where each gun could protect another. It was a flying fortress in the truest sense. Geometry as armor. At 25,000 feet, a single box could fill an entire section of sky with defensive fire. German fighters attacking head-on faced a barrage of tracers so thick it looked like a burning wall. Pilots described it as swimming through bullets. Each formation moved like clockwork, guided by navigators armed with radar and Norden bomb sights, inventions that gave precision at high altitude previously thought impossible. Bomb loads could now fall within a few hundred feet of their targets. The tactical synergy between design, discipline, and mass was extraordinary. Where Luftwaffe pilots relied on instinct and daring, the Americans relied on numbers and synchronization. Each formation was a reflection of the very production system that built it. Efficient, standardized, and relentless. When observers on the ground saw those shining columns of aircraft passing overhead, they weren't just seeing machines. They were seeing the assembly lines of Detroit and Dallas flying in formation. The moral and economic angle. The price of progress. For all its brilliance, industrial warfare came with a heavy cost. Factories that produced bombers by the hour also consumed human lives by the day. Aircrew survival rates during the 1943-44 campaign were devastating. On some missions, entire groups were wiped out before reaching the target. To many, the production miracle felt like a grim equation. One life replaced by another from a training base thousands of miles away. Economically, the scale was staggering. The United States spent over $45 billion in 1940s dollars on aircraft production alone. But in the minds of Allied leaders, it wasn't an expense. It was an investment in ending the war faster. Inside Germany, however, the moral dimension looked different. Civilians in bombed cities saw the cost of America's industrial reach. Factories flattened, families buried beneath rubble, skies that never stayed quiet. The war had transformed into an equation of attrition that neither side could fully comprehend. And yet, by sheer momentum, the United States was proving a brutal truth. In total war, machines built faster than men can be destroyed will always prevail. As winter turned to 1944, that truth would finally take shape over Europe in the operation that broke the Luftwaffe's back. February 1944. Big week. It began before sunrise on February 20th, when the first contrails appeared over the North Sea. This was the operation that would decide whether America's faith in daylight bombing that day and its promise of production supremacy could truly break the Luftwaffe. The code name was Operation Argument, but the men who flew it called it something simpler. Big week. The plan was unprecedented. For 6 consecutive days, the 8th and 15th Air Forces would launch massive raids against every cornerstone of the German aircraft industry: Regensburg, Leipzig, Brunswick, Gotha, and Augsburg. The targets were chosen to paralyze Germany's ability to build and repair fighters. At 0600 hours, more than 1,000 bombers lifted off from England, joined later by hundreds from Italy. Escort fighters fanned out across the Channel, among them the newly operational P-51 Mustangs, sleek and fast, with silver wings catching the pale light. They were still few in number, but they were a promise. The first American fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to Germany and back. Inside the bombers, crews moved through the ritual of mission prep. Oxygen masks tested, bombs armed, guns loaded. The engines shook the ground. Men who had never seen their targets in person would soon reshape them forever. As the formations reached the Rhine, the horizon came alive with black flak bursts. German radar sites tracked them from the moment they crossed the coast. Fighters scrambled from every field still operational. Messerschmitts from JG-11, Focke-Wulfs from JG-300, even a few of the new Me-410s from bomber interception units. To the Luftwaffe, this was the last stand of organized defense. But something had changed. For the first time, when the German fighters broke through the contrails to attack, they were met not just by the bombers' defensive fire, but by swarms of long-range escorts. The P-51s dove like arrows, catching the interceptors before they reached the formations. Veteran German ace Walter Dahl later recalled, "They came from nowhere, sleek, fast, and they stayed with the bombers all the way. There was no safe altitude anymore. Over Leipzig, Halle, and Regensburg, the sky became a rolling storm of metal. B-17s flew on fire, wings shearing off in mid-air, crews bailing out into the frozen air. But the stream never stopped. Behind every falling bomber came another, then another, perfectly spaced, perfectly timed. The physical manifestation of the assembly lines half a world away. In command bunkers below, German controllers listened in disbelief as new bomber groups were reported crossing the Channel while the first waves were still returning home. The tempo was unrelenting, exactly as General Arnold had intended. The Luftwaffe's fighters fought with desperate courage, but they were trapped in a system collapsing under its own weight. Aircraft factories like Augsburg and Gotha burned for days. The fighter assembly lines at Leipzig and Regensburg were hit so hard that production slowed by nearly 60% in a single week. More than 3,000 American bombers and 800 fighters flew in the 6 days of Big Week. Nearly 500 aircraft were lost. Thousands of airmen killed or captured. But for every bomber destroyed, another was already being rolled out of a plant in Michigan, Dallas, or San Diego, Germany. Meanwhile, could not replace its losses. The Luftwaffe's pilot corps was thinning. Every experienced ace shot down represented months of irreplaceable training. By the final day of Big Week, even the most hardened German commanders understood that something irreversible had begun. They had been outnumbered before, but never outbuilt. When the surviving bombers returned to their airfields in England, ground crews counted bullet holes and patched fuselages, but the mission was clear. The Reich's air defense was breaking. In the after-action reports, one line stood out, a quiet confirmation of what America's industrial machine had achieved. Enemy aircraft production will not recover. The factories we destroy today cannot be rebuilt faster than we can replace what we lose. The war had reached its turning point in the sky. By the end of Big Week, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The relentless stream of American bombers, once a slow, uncertain experiment, had become a storm system of precision and rhythm. In the days following the raids, the scale of devastation stunned even Allied analysts. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories at Regensburg, Augsburg, and Leipzig were shattered. Production data captured later showed that February 1944 marked the beginning of an irreversible collapse in German fighter output. Assembly lines that had once turned out aircraft weekly now struggled for parts, labor, and fuel. But the most devastating blow was human. The Luftwaffe's Jagdwaffe, once filled with elite veterans, was bleeding pilots faster than they could be replaced. Many of the youngest recruits had less than 50 hours of flight training, barely enough to handle a fighter, let alone survive against Mustangs and Fortresses. As spring 1944 unfolded, the Germans began launching intercepts with mixed units, combinations of FW-190s, Bf-109Gs, and makeshift twin-engine fighters carrying heavy cannons. They relied increasingly on ground-controlled interception and sheer courage. But courage could not refuel planes when oil refineries lay in ruins. Meanwhile, American operations accelerated. Each returning bomber group was rearmed, refueled, and repaired within hours. Willow Run and other factories continued their mechanical heartbeat, one new bomber per hour. To a German ace watching the contrails above, it felt like fighting against time itself. In April 1944, U.S. strategists shifted focus to the oil campaign, a calculated strike against the lifeblood of the German war machine. Refineries at Ploesti, Leuna, and Merseburg became prime targets. The logic was brutally simple. Without aviation fuel, even the most advanced fighter became a statue on the runway. As raids intensified, Luftwaffe airfields filled with aircraft that could not take off. Fuel reserves dropped to fractions of pre-war levels. By June 1944, on the eve of D-Day, entire wings were grounded. German pilots described watching bombers pass overhead with empty tanks in their own planes. One recalled bitterly, "We watched them fly to our factories. We could not even start our engines." What big week had begun? The destruction of Germany's aircraft industry, now merged with a total war of attrition that Germany could no longer sustain. On the American side, the mood had changed as well. Losses were still heavy, but morale soared. Crews knew they were now part of something unstoppable, an industrial rhythm that no nation had ever achieved. Every aircraft that rose into the sky represented not only 10 men, but thousands behind them. Machinists, metallurgists, engineers, farmers, truck drivers. Each mission carried the weight of a nation's collective labor. Even as bombers fell burning through the clouds, the mission briefings for the next day were already being printed. Replacement crews boarded transports in New York, flew to England, and were in combat within days. America had transformed the chaos of war into a production cycle, turning tragedy into tempo. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was dying not from lack of courage, but from exhaustion. Between January and June 1944, it lost nearly 2,200 aircraft and 5,000 trained pilots. The American losses were high, but they were replaceable. The German ones were not. By the summer, when Allied troops stormed ashore in Normandy, the air above the beaches was American. Luftwaffe sorties dwindled to desperate, isolated attacks. For the German High Command, the reports were chilling. One internal memo from mid-1944 read, "Fighter strength cannot be restored. Production destroyed, fuel gone, morale collapsing." The German aces who once mocked America's mass-produced air force now faced the cruel irony of industrial war. That quantity, when disciplined by quality, becomes a weapon greater than any single pilot's skill. The factories of Michigan and Texas had done what dogfights alone could not. They had conquered the sky. By August 1944, U.S. air superiority was complete. Every bombing raid now met only scattered resistance. What began as a gamble, that America could fight and win a war through production, had become a scientific fact. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely until the end, but the rhythm of war had changed forever. As one German officer later admitted in captivity, "We were defeated not in the air, But in the factories we never bombed. That was the final echo of Big Week. The moment the world learned that the true battlefield of the 20th century was not land or sky, but the assembly line. The aftermath of Big Week was both immediate and invisible. Immediate in the sense that factories burned and production charts nosedived, invisible in the deeper collapse it set in motion. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its losses in pilots, aircraft, and infrastructure could no longer be recovered. Germany's aircraft industry, once the most advanced in Europe, was now fighting fires both literal and strategic. Official German production reports from that spring show a dramatic pattern. Where monthly fighter output had once exceeded 2,000, it dropped by nearly half. The reason wasn't only bomb damage, it was fragmentation. Power plants were destroyed, railway lines severed, skilled workers killed or scattered. For the Allied command, these numbers confirmed what radar and reconnaissance already suggested. Air superiority was now a mathematical certainty. But the cost was staggering. Nearly 3,500 American airmen had been killed or captured during Big Week alone. Airfields in England overflowed with wounded men and shattered aircraft. Yet morale remained unbroken. Commanders like Jimmy Doolittle reminded crews that their losses had not been in vain. For every bomber that falls, he said, 10 more rise behind it. And indeed, they did. Willow Run continued to hum. The Douglas and Boeing plants pushed through record nights. New squadrons of B-24s, B-17s, and even the massive B-29 Super Fortress began to crowd American skies. Training centers in Texas and Arizona turned out fresh crews almost as fast as factories turned out planes. What had once seemed like reckless overproduction was now America's strongest shield. In May 1944, American bombers struck deeper into Germany than ever before. Berlin, Hanover, Dresden. The raids were no longer probing or testing. They were annihilating. The Luftwaffe, unable to mass interceptors, could only scramble small formations that were cut apart by escorting Mustangs before they reached the bombers. For the first time since 1939, the German people saw their own cities suffer what their bombers had once inflicted on others. Inside German command, despair began to replace confidence. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, head of aircraft production, warned that our factories no longer exist in any coherent form. Hitler, furious and detached, demanded miracle weapons, the Me-262 jet, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, to reverse the tide. But they arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Allies, meanwhile, were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord. The destruction of the Luftwaffe's backbone ensured that D-Day would unfold, under skies almost entirely free of German opposition. True victory of Big Week wasn't counted in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in the freedom of the air it secured. From that moment forward, the Allied war machine could move across Europe unchallenged. Every bridge destroyed, every rail line severed, every tank halted by lack of fuel, all traced back to those February skies where industrial might had proven deadlier than bullets. The German pilots who survived began to understand that they were fighting a war already lost in the factories of Michigan and California. By summer 1944, the effects of America's industrial dominance were written across the sky. Every day, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s crossed into occupied Europe like clockwork. Factories, rail yards, and oil depots disappeared beneath the weight of high explosive tonnage. The Luftwaffe's attempts at recovery were tragic in scale. Fighter units were replenished with barely trained boys, many under 20 years old, who faced entire wings of seasoned Allied pilots. The German aircraft industry, now dispersed into caves and forests to escape detection, could no longer sustain quality control. Aircraft rolled out incomplete, engines failed in flight, and shortages of high-octane fuel grounded entire squadrons. By contrast, the United States had achieved what historians later called war on schedule. In 1944 alone, American factories produced nearly 96,000 aircraft, almost 18,000 of them heavy bombers. The rhythm was so exact that the U.S. War Department could project the number of planes available 6 months in advance with near-perfect accuracy. It wasn't luck. It was logistics turned into science. Behind these numbers were the lives of the workers who kept that rhythm alive. The same women who once learned to rivet by demonstration now trained newcomers in night schools. The same factory whistles that marked lunch breaks in peacetime now dictated global warfare. Shift by shift, the United States turned industrial timing into military tempo. By September 1944, reconnaissance photos confirmed the new reality. German synthetic fuel plants were in ruins. Tank divisions sat idle, unable to move. Fighter production, once a proud symbol of German engineering, had collapsed by more than 80%. In the air, fewer and fewer black crosses rose to meet the silver swarms. American bomber crews who once fought for survival now flew missions almost unopposed. The skies above Europe belonged to the United States and its allies. The bomber that rolled off the line every hour was no longer just a machine. It was a statement of inevitability. Yet, amid victory, the cost weighed heavily. More than 120,000 Allied airmen would never return home. For every gleaming liberator that rose into the clouds, there were names written on memorial walls from England to Kansas. Industrial war had no heroes without sacrifice. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the full scale of America's industrial achievement came into view. The U.S. had built over 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than all Axis powers combined. It had trained over 2.4 million aviation personnel, established more than 700 new airfields, and delivered enough spare parts to rebuild an entire air force every 6 months. German prisoners of war, especially pilots, were stunned when they saw the aerial photographs and factory statistics. They realized they had never stood a chance. One captured Luftwaffe officer reportedly said during interrogation, "We fought like lions, but you built like gods." It was not arrogance that defeated the Reich's air power. It was organization, discipline, and the ability to build faster than destruction could keep up. By the war's end, the Willow Run plant closed its assembly line. The hangars fell silent. The women and men who had once built bombers returned to ordinary lives, their hands still marked by aluminum dust. But the legacy they left behind was permanent. They had proved that a democracy could outproduce a dictatorship, that free citizens working together could become an unstoppable force. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not just an aerial loss, it was the collapse of an entire industrial philosophy. In the contest between craftsmanship and mass production, efficiency had won the war. In the end, the war in the air was not only a clash of pilots, it was the collision of two philosophies. Germany had entered the conflict believing that quality, precision, and heroism would triumph. America entered it believing that organization, learning, and sheer production could make victory inevitable. Big Week proved which vision the 20th century would follow. From the frozen fields of East Anglia to the factory floors of Michigan, the equation was written in steel and smoke. The power to build faster than destruction could keep up was the true measure of victory. Every bomber that crossed the channel represented a nation's ability to coordinate millions of hands, minds, and machines into one purpose. The German aces, men of immense skill and courage, fought against something no pilot could outfly: time itself. For every moment they spent in combat, America's industrial clock kept ticking, stamping, riveting. A new plane rose for everyone that fell. When the war ended in 1945, the world had learned a profound truth. The might of a nation was no longer measured by how many soldiers it could field, but by how efficiently it could mobilize its industry, train its people, and adapt its technology. The bomber built every hour was not just a statistic. It was a symbol of modern warfare's new age. It showed that democracy, when fully awakened, could outthink, outbuild, and outlast tyranny. Today, the rusted remains of those B-24s and B-17s lie silent in museums and airfields across the world. Yet the idea they carried still echoes, that freedom is sustained not only by courage, but by coordination, not only by bravery, but by unity. And perhaps somewhere, in the quiet hum of a modern assembly line, that same rhythm still beats. The sound of a nation building faster than fear can destroy. Thank you for watching this cinematic documentary. If this story inspired you, please subscribe and tell us in the comments which city or country you're watching from. History lives when we share it together.